William didn't know that Harry and Meghan had already recorded their poison.
For months, Meghan's carefully planned return to royal relevance appeared effortless. Every photograph, announcement, and private message seemed designed to remind the palace that she still possessed influence. But behind the polished image was a secret calculation, and Catherine was unknowingly at the center of it. The tension began quietly. Catherine stepped into another major royal appearance and was met with the kind of praise Meghan had once believed would belong to her. Commentators spoke about grace, stability, and duty. Social media filled with admiration. Meanwhile, Meghan's own recent announcement struggled to hold the same attention. It had been carefully prepared, timed, and presented, yet the public conversation kept drifting back toward Catherine. Meghan never openly called her a rival. That would have been too obvious. The competition lived in smaller choices: the timing of a statement, the meaning behind a photograph, the causes each woman supported, the clothes they wore, and the headlines that followed. Every reaction became part of an invisible score. Every surge of public affection seemed to confirm who the institution valued most. Beneath Meghan's ambition was an older wound. She had entered royal life believing popularity, hard work, and global attention could make her equally important. But the structure of the monarchy had already decided otherwise. William and Catherine stood closer to the crown, and no amount of applause could erase that hierarchy. So Meghan began studying Catherine's appearances more closely. She watched which speeches created sympathy, which family moments softened public opinion, and which causes produced the strongest emotional response. It was not simple imitation. Meghan wanted something larger. She wanted to prove she could eclipse Catherine without palace protection, official ceremonies, or the machinery of the crown. Harry noticed the change. Conversations inside their home increasingly returned to palace coverage, newspaper headlines, online comparisons, and Catherine's approval. At first, he listened. Then the pattern began to trouble him. Their new life was supposed to be free from royal competition. Yet the palace seemed more present than ever. One trusted advisor finally warned Meghan that the strategy carried a dangerous risk. If the public noticed the pattern, confidence could quickly look like desperation. Meghan dismissed the concern. Each announcement would appear natural, she insisted. No one would see the hidden structure connecting them. But inside the palace, aides had already begun comparing dates. Meghan's biggest moments were arriving too close to Catherine's most important appearances to ignore. What Meghan believed was still private had become the subject of quiet, careful discussion behind closed doors. And once the palace began examining the pattern, Meghan's carefully hidden competition was no longer a private ambition, it was a strategy waiting to be exposed. The plan was more detailed than anyone imagined. Dates were compared, headlines predicted, photographs selected, and emotional messages prepared in advance. Meghan was not merely reacting to Catherine's success. She was allegedly building an entire public campaign around the future queen's royal calendar, and one mistake could reveal everything. At the center of the operation was said to be a private planning document created within Meghan's communications circle. It contained possible launch dates, interview windows, charity announcements, family photographs, and carefully chosen personal revelations. Yet Catherine's scheduled appearances were not marked as moments to avoid. They were treated as openings, opportunities to interrupt the royal message and redirect public attention. Meghan believed the audience could be read. Catherine represented duty, restraint, continuity, and the protected future of the monarchy. Meghan believed she could offer the opposite: vulnerability, freedom, glamour, rebellion, and the emotional honesty the palace rarely allowed. If both women entered the same news cycle, she was convinced the contrast would work in her favor. The first major test came just before Catherine was due to attend an important national event. Meghan released a deeply personal announcement, designed to feel intimate but powerful. The timing was deliberate. She expected television panels, newspapers, and online commentators to place their names beside each other, turning two separate stories into one unavoidable comparison. For a brief moment, the strategy appeared brilliant. Meghan's name surged across social media. International outlets discussed her return to public life, and supporters praised what they called a confident new beginning. The palace event had not yet started, but Meghan had already seized part of the conversation. Harry, however, was uneasy. He asked whether the timing looked too obvious. Meghan rejected the concern. Avoiding Catherine's schedule, she argued, would mean accepting that Catherine controlled not only the royal calendar, but Meghan's life beyond it. From that point, the details became more calculated. Clothing was chosen to create softness and warmth. Family images were selected to feel natural and emotionally open. Locations were meant to suggest freedom, especially when Catherine's appearances were formal and controlled. Inside the palace, aides began recording every overlap. What looked like coincidence once now appeared increasingly deliberate. William was informed, but he refused to respond, convinced that any public reaction would strengthen Meghan's campaign. Catherine remained silent. She sensed that private family moments were repeatedly being surrounded by competing headlines, but she did not challenge them. Meghan had expected defense, anger, perhaps even retaliation. Instead, Catherine gave her nothing. Meghan had prepared for resistance, retaliation, and rivalry, but Catherine's silence created a far more dangerous problem. Meghan was beginning to compete alone. Meghan expected Catherine to respond. A sharper speech, a carefully placed photograph, perhaps even a palace briefing would confirm that the competition was real. Instead, Catherine offered nothing. Her silence left Meghan without an opponent and forced the public to examine who was creating the rivalry in the first place. Meghan followed Catherine's next appearance closely, searching for the smallest sign that the palace had changed course. A different phrase, a more personal message, a carefully timed photograph. Anything that might prove her campaign had forced a reaction. But Catherine proceeded exactly as planned. She spoke about duty, family, and the purpose of the engagement, refusing to acknowledge Meghan or the noise gathering around them. That silence began to reshape the story. Commentators praised Catherine's restraint, while Meghan's promotional activity appeared increasingly aggressive beside it. Catherine did not encourage the comparison, yet the contrast grew stronger with every headline. One woman seemed steady, the other appeared to be chasing a response that never came. Meghan's team saw the danger immediately. The coverage was no longer presenting two powerful women locked in an equal contest. It was presenting Catherine as secure and Meghan as reactive. Meghan refused to accept that judgment. She argued that the campaign needed a larger emotional moment, something so personal that royal tradition could not compete with it. Harry became more direct. Their future, he warned, was becoming tied to the very people they claimed to have left behind. But Meghan believed distance had never truly existed. Catherine still benefited from the institution Meghan blamed for their pain. In her mind, that made competition unavoidable, even if the palace refused to admit it. A senior advisor urged caution. The next announcement should be delayed, creating enough space to weaken the comparison. Meghan rejected the suggestion. Waiting would look like fear. Worse, it would hand Catherine another uncontested victory. So Meghan chose a project built around family, motherhood, legacy, and her children's royal connection. Every detail carried meaning. The message reminded the public that Archie and Lilibet were not outsiders to royal history, even if they were being raised far from palace walls. Palace insiders allegedly understood the symbolism at once. The release had been placed beside an appearance connected to Catherine's future role as queen. William urged aides to remain disciplined. No briefing. No response. No interference. Catherine was informed of the timing, but changed nothing. not her speech, her clothing, her schedule, or her message. That calm refusal to engage made Meghan's next move even more exposed. The rivalry had survived through implication and coincidence, but Meghan's next announcement would remove every layer of protection and reveal exactly what she had been trying to prove. The announcement was meant to be Meghan's decisive victory. It contained family emotion, royal symbolism, carefully chosen photographs, and a message about modern leadership. But within hours, observers uncovered the pattern connecting it to Catherine, and the private competition Meghan had denied suddenly became impossible to hide. The campaign presented Meghan exactly as she wanted to be seen: compassionate, independent, globally minded, and deeply devoted to her children. It was polished without appearing cold, emotional without seeming weak, and modern without completely severing its connection to royal history. Every message suggested that Meghan had created a new form of leadership beyond palace walls, yet the themes were impossible to ignore. Early childhood, family stability, motherhood, service, emotional well-being, and responsibility toward future generations had all become closely associated with Catherine's public work. Meghan's release touched each of them, but with a sharper promise. Catherine represented duty within the system. Meghan would represent freedom beyond it. The timing made the contrast unavoidable. The campaign arrived on the eve of Catherine's most significant appearance in months, ensuring that both women would occupy the same news cycle. Meghan expected the press to frame it as a dramatic contest between the monarchy's future queen and the Duchess who had escaped royal control. At first, the plan seemed to succeed. Headlines placed their names together. Social media divided into rival camps. Television panels revived old stories of tension, jealousy, and palace favoritism. For a few hours, Meghan had achieved exactly what she wanted. Then the investigation began. Journalists and online researchers compared the launch with Meghan's earlier announcements. Dates were placed beside Catherine's engagements. Similar themes resurfaced. Wardrobe choices, family photographs, charitable language, and interview releases began forming a pattern that no longer looked accidental. The most damaging claim came from a former member of Meghan's wider professional circle, who allegedly suggested that Catherine's calendar had been discussed during planning. Suddenly, the campaign's emotional meaning changed. What had been designed to appear confident now looked calculated around another woman's duties. Harry was reportedly stunned by the scale of the reaction. He understood the timing carried competition, but he had not expected outsiders to describe the entire strategy as an obsession with Catherine. Meghan blamed the media. She argued that her independent work was being deliberately reduced to another royal feud because the palace could not tolerate her influence. But her advisors warned that anger would not erase the timeline. Old announcements were already being reposted as evidence. Inside the palace, aides remained silent. Catherine continued her engagement without changing her message or acknowledging the controversy. The contrast became devastating. Meghan appeared consumed by a contest, while Catherine seemed unaware that one even existed. Meghan demanded that her team reclaim the story before Catherine's appearance ended. But by then, the narrative no longer belonged to her. The secret was now public. But exposure alone was not the humiliation Meghan feared most. The real blow came when the audience delivered a verdict she had never prepared to hear. Meghan had expected controversy, but controversy still guaranteed attention. What she had not expected was laughter, pity, and the accusation that she was chasing a woman who refused to run. The campaign designed to eclipse Catherine now threatened to define Meghan by the very rivalry she wanted to win. The public reaction shifted with brutal speed. At first, people had debated the project itself. Then they began questioning why Meghan's biggest announcements seemed to repeatedly collide with Catherine's royal schedule. Viral posts placed dates side by side, comparing launches, interviews, family images, and charitable themes. The conclusion spreading online was devastating. Meghan's attempt to prove her independence had only revealed how closely her choices still revolved around palace life. Television commentators delivered an even harsher judgment. Catherine's silence, they argued, had become her most powerful response. She had not issued a denial, changed her plans, or entered the argument, yet by refusing to compete, she appeared to have won. Soon, Meghan's original message was almost forgotten. The charitable purpose of the campaign disappeared beneath stories about strategy, timing, and rivalry. Sponsors and professional partners began worrying that future projects might also be interpreted as attacks on the royal family rather than work capable of standing alone. When advisors recommended removing several promotional images and delaying planned interviews, Meghan reportedly reacted with fury. To her, retreat meant surrender. To her team, continuing as though nothing had happened would prove she did not understand the scale of the collapse. Harry could no longer remain quiet. He asked whether their life in California had become another version of the palace conflict they had claimed to escape. Meghan pushed back. Catherine, she argued, had always benefited from hierarchy, controlled access, institutional silence, and a protective royal machine. Meghan had been forced to build influence without any of it. But Harry's answer cut through every defense. Catherine had not created the comparison this time. Meghan's own campaign had placed them together. That was the real humiliation. Catherine had not attacked her, mocked her, or challenged her position. Meghan's attempt to eclipse her had exposed an insecurity she believed was hidden. The harder she tried to appear free of the monarchy, the more tightly the public connected her to it. Inside the palace, staff were allegedly instructed not to celebrate, brief the press, or display satisfaction. Catherine's appearance received warm coverage focused on duty, composure, and personal strength. Meghan's announcement, meanwhile, became secondary to the story of its failed timing. A follow-up interview was postponed because every question would have centered on Catherine. The public verdict was merciless. Catherine appeared secure, while Meghan still seemed to be asking the world to compare them. As the public moved on, the damage followed Meghan home, where the failed competition forced Harry to confront a question neither of them had been willing to ask. Harry had defended Meghan against the palace, the press, and members of his own family. But this time, the threat had not come from outside their home. It came from a strategy created within it, and he could no longer ignore how much of their new life remained controlled by the old one. As Meghan and her advisors argued over how to repair the campaign, Harry slowly withdrew from the meetings. Every solution sounded familiar. Another palace reference. Another comparison with Catherine. Another message aimed at William. What had begun as damage control was turning into yet another battle with the family they had supposedly left behind. Harry's fear was no longer about one failed announcement. It was about identity. Their public story had become so closely tied to royal conflict that silence from the palace now felt more threatening than criticism. Without that tension, he wondered what remained of the version of themselves they had presented to the world. Meghan saw his hesitation differently. To her, it looked like betrayal. She reminded him of the years when William and Catherine had allegedly benefited from stories that painted her as difficult, demanding, and unstable. Harry did not deny the pain, but he asked a harder question. Were they now rebuilding the same machine through strategic leaks, emotional revelations, and carefully chosen dates? The argument moved beyond Catherine. Harry wanted distance. Meghan wanted recognition. She insisted she had no desire to return to palace control. What she wanted was proof that leaving had not reduced her importance. Harry's reply struck at the center of the conflict. If defeating Catherine remained necessary, then Catherine still controlled their decisions. That truth deepened Meghan's isolation. Several advisors began distancing themselves from the campaign, privately blaming her refusal to delay the release. Meghan became convinced that someone close to the project had leaked discussions about Catherine's calendar. Calls grew tense. Loyalty was questioned. People were asked to explain old messages, private meetings, and conversations that had once seemed harmless. Harry refused to support a public accusation without evidence. Meghan saw caution. He saw danger. The gap between them widened. Inside the palace, aides heard whispers of the disagreement but chose not to interfere. They understood that any response could reunite Harry and Meghan against a common enemy. Catherine privately expressed discomfort that her name had become attached to Meghan's professional collapse. Yet she maintained her silence. William was less sympathetic. He believed Harry was finally being forced to face what he had avoided for years. The palace could not be blamed for every crisis that followed him. But Meghan was not ready to let the story die. Instead of abandoning the rivalry, she began considering something more explosive, revealing the private history that, in her mind, explained why the competition had existed from the beginning. Meghan could accept defeat and allow the story to disappear or reopen the most painful chapter of royal life and prove that the rivalry had begun long before the public noticed it. Behind Meghan's failed campaign was an older humiliation, one she believed had been buried beneath royal smiles and carefully staged appearances. To explain her competition with Catherine, she would have to expose the moments that made her feel secondary, unwanted, and permanently trapped beneath the future queen. When Meghan first entered royal life, she believed public energy could change the balance of power. She attracted international attention, drew large crowds, and brought a sense of modern excitement to an institution often accused of resisting change. For a time, she believed popularity might give her an influence equal to Catherine's. But the palace operated by a colder rule. Catherine was not simply another duchess. She was married to the future king, and was the mother of future heirs. Her position was built into the monarchy itself, protected by tradition long before Meghan arrived. That difference followed Meghan everywhere. Similar behavior appeared to receive opposite judgments. Catherine's silence was called discipline. Meghan's was described as calculation. Catherine could be cautious and appear composed. Meghan could make the same choice and be accused of being difficult. The message became even clearer during private ceremonial moments. Seating plans placed Catherine closer to the center. Procession orders protected her precedence. Heirloom jewelry, access to senior royals, and proximity to the monarch all reflected a hierarchy no amount of public admiration could overturn. Harry tried to explain that these rules existed before either woman entered the family. Meghan believed that missed the point. In her view, palace aides did not merely follow tradition, they used it selectively, turning protocol into a quiet weapon whenever she became too visible. One incident remained especially painful. Meghan had proposed a major initiative and expected it to become an important part of her royal work. Instead, she was reportedly advised to delay it because Catherine was preparing a project in a similar area. To Catherine, it may have been nothing more than scheduling. To Meghan, it was proof that Catherine's platform would always be protected first, even if Meghan's idea had come earlier or carried greater momentum. Her later campaign outside the palace was meant to reverse that memory. No courtier could order her to wait. No procession could place her behind Catherine. Yet by organizing announcements around Catherine's appearances, Meghan had unknowingly recreated the same hierarchy she wanted to destroy. Harry warned that revealing these grievances would not justify the competition. It might confirm it. Still, Meghan feared silence would leave Catherine looking innocent while she carried the blame alone. A proposed interview was drafted around the idea of an invisible competition forced upon her inside the palace. Legal and communications advisors warned that naming incidents could trigger denials, revive old disputes, and destroy relationships already hanging by a thread. With the interview prepared and the palace bracing for another attack, Meghan faced the decision that would determine whether the humiliation became temporary or followed her forever. Meghan's greatest defeat was not losing a headline battle. It was discovering that the competition had trapped her more effectively than palace protocol ever had. Catherine remained protected by silence, duty, and history, while Meghan was left deciding whether one final revelation would destroy the future she had built. The proposed interview promised everything the public had been waiting for: claims of hierarchy, favoritism, press protection, jealousy, royal titles, restricted family access, and the emotional treatment Meghan believed she had endured behind palace doors. One appearance could return her to the center of global attention. It could force the palace to answer. It could also reopen every wound. Harry opposed it immediately. Another attack, he warned, might permanently destroy what little remained of his relationship with Charles and William. Meghan refused to see silence as reconciliation. To her, peace without acknowledgement meant accepting the palace's version of events and carrying the blame alone. Her advisors were more direct. The interview would create headlines, but those headlines would come at a price. Every future launch, charity project, business venture, and personal announcement would be measured against Catherine. Meghan wanted to prove that she no longer needed royal status, yet nearly every major move still depended on royal comparison. That was the contradiction she could no longer escape. Catherine's refusal to respond had made her almost impossible to defeat. Another accusation might look unprovoked. Remaining silent, however, would leave Meghan alone with the humiliation. For the first time, neither confrontation nor retreat offered victory. In the end, Meghan postponed the interview. Publicly, the decision was presented as a desire to focus on family, healing, and future projects. Privately, it felt less like strategy and more like surrender. The palace continued without comment, as though the crisis had never reached its doors. Harry felt relief, but not resolution. He understood that Meghan still believed she had been denied the importance she deserved. The interview was delayed, not forgotten. Catherine returned to her duties, yet palace planning quietly changed. Aides began anticipating possible announcements whenever she faced a major appearance. William became more protective of her schedule, determined that old family battles would not repeatedly consume her public work. Meghan also imposed a new rule on her team: no future launch would be tied to royal dates, anniversaries, ceremonies, or Catherine's engagements. But the damage had already altered how the public saw her. Even independent choices were now interpreted through the rivalry she had accidentally confirmed. That was the true cost. Meghan had not simply lost to Catherine. She had given the world a reason to believe Catherine had always been the measure of her success. And if Meghan's next major project collided with the royal calendar again, the competition everyone thought had ended could return more fiercely than before.